Affinity Designer on the iPad is pretty awesome, but it also comes with a completely different interface than the desktop version, and that can be a little intimidating at first. So here are my 10 tips to get you off to a fast start. I spent a lot of time over the last couple weeks using Affinity Designer for the iPad to create my new Udemy course. There's a link down below. So I've got 10 tips that I think are going to be really helpful if you're just jumping into it for the first time. Tip 1, use your fingers. You want to move a shape in a straight line? Put a finger down. You want to resize a shape and keep its proportions? Put a finger down. You want to keep a napkin from blowing away in a windstorm? Put a finger down. That one's an extra tip. You can thank me later. Most of the tools in Affinity Designer take advantage of hand gestures, and so you should try them everywhere. And it's not just one finger. If one finger resizes your shape at its proportions, what do two fingers do? It resizes your shape from the center point of that shape. And if you put 3 fingers down on the canvas, it's going to resize that shape from the center point and keep your proportions. Number 2, the palette menus have hidden gestures. You want a narrower stroke? Put your finger on the stroke palette and pull down on the screen. You want it bigger? Put your finger on the palette icon and slide it upward. And it's not just the strokes. Almost all of these palettes have similar functions. You want to change color? Slide up and down. Changing your text size? Yep, does the same exact thing. Number 3, you can install fonts on an iPad. I know, right? Affinity Designer makes it so much easier to install fonts than any other program I've used on the iPad. In fact, it's the only program I know of that lets you install fonts on the iPad. There's probably something else out there, but I'm just not familiar with it. Doing it is pretty easy, but you can't do it from inside the application. You have to go back to the gallery and then click on the little gear icon in the upper right-hand corner. That will take you to your preferences, and you will see on the very right there is a tab called Fonts, and if you tap on that, guess what? You can install your fonts. Now, downloading a font from a service like, say, Google Fonts is still a little clunky on the iPad. Right now, I think it's easiest to find your fonts on the desktop, download them, unzip them, and stick them in a cloud folder of some kind before you do this. But you can do it on an iPad if you're resourceful enough. I'm using a little app called iZip. If I go to Google Fonts and I get all the fonts that I want, it's going to give me a large zip file with all the weights and different things that I have chosen. I can use iZip to unzip that. It'll pop them on my iPad, and then I can open it up in Affinity Designer. Also, iZip is free, which is why I recommend it. Number 4, rotate your canvas. By default, the canvas in Affinity Designer doesn't rotate. Now, if you're using some of the hand drawing tools, because there are some nice pixel tools in there, if you're like me, I like to rotate a little bit just to get that perfect angle on that stroke. You can do that in Affinity Designer. It's back in the same preferences menu where we're just looking at the fonts. It is in the tools section, and there is a little icon that you can toggle on that says allow canvas rotation in all tools. This is a long list. We need an intermission. That's not what I meant. Number 5, zoom is your friend. This may seem obvious, but if you're using Affinity for the first time, you might get a little bit frustrated. I know I did. That's because I'm often accidentally grabbing the wrong points or the wrong nodes, as they call them. Because the interface is designed to be used with your finger, if you have multiple nodes in one area, it can be hard to grab the right one or to have it do the right thing, even if you're using an Apple Pencil. But this is where zoom becomes your friend. If you ever find yourself having a hard time moving something and it resizes it, or you grab the wrong node, just zoom in and it will fix everything. And since Affinity Designer zooms in and out so smoothly, it just becomes a natural part of your workflow after a while. Number 6, you don't need an Apple Pencil. In fact, you don't need any stylus. It's amazing how well this app works without one. In fact, I spent a lot of my time just using my fingers to navigate around and do everything. You might be thinking, but I want the pressure sensitivity, and yeah, it's good for that. In fact, if you're using like pen strokes or if you're inking something up, that can be really handy. But if you don't have a stylus handy, you can still do that. In the strokes menu, there's an ability to add your own levels of pressure to every single stroke. And even after I used the Apple Pencil to apply pressure, I found it really handy to go in there and adjust it after the fact. If I was using something like, say, PROCREATE, what I might do is I might draw a line and then I might say, oh, it tapers out too much here. So I'd go in and very carefully add a little extra to the back of the line. This time, I can just grab that stroke and say, I want it to be a little wider at the end. Number 7, if you are ever stuck, check the contextual menu. menus. Along the bottom of the screen, this little square menu pops up whenever you select any tool, and every single tool has a different contextual menu associated with it. And if you ever ask yourself, how do I do this to a shape? Well, grab the shape tool and see what's in the contextual menu. If you're wondering how to do something with text, grab the text tool and see what's in that contextual menu. There's just a lot of good stuff buried in that contextual menu that you don't see at first until you dive into it. Number 8, organizing your layers in groups. If you've never used Affinity Designer before, it might be a little disorienting when you first draw a shape and realize every single shape and every single line you draw becomes its own layer. Technically, it's not a layer. It's just a shape in your layer palette. And once you get used to it, it's actually really helpful. Here's what I would recommend. Every time you go to add a different chunk to your illustration, create a different layer. And then I lock down all of the layers that contained elements that I'm not currently working on. That means you're not going to accidentally grab anything in the background. You're not going to accidentally add a bunch of shapes to a layer that you don't want to. It just makes life easier. Number 9 goes along with this. It is take advantage of the masking features. I like to block in my basic shapes and then use those as masks to put in all of my textures and put in all my other shapes. And Affinity makes it really easy. Just by dragging to the middle of any given shape, that shape will become masked inside of it. And since you could do this with pixel layers, you can add different textures, you could add different things, and you don't have to worry about going back and erasing the parts that ever overlap. And since masks are so much easier to use, I find that I use them much more than I did when I was using Adobe Illustrator. And number 10 is take advantage of the shape tools. There's so many cool things you could do with the shapes. Every time you draw one, it puts these little red dots on them. These allow you to adjust certain parameters of that shape. Now, this is kind of obvious, but the reason I'm including it is because you might be wondering if you've used another vector program. After you lay down a shape, you can use the white node tool to say, modify that shape. Affinity Designer works a little bit differently. Since all the shapes have their own parameters that you can adjust independently, if you want to modify it by hand, you have to first convert it to curves. Once that shape is converted to curves, then you can go in with the node tool and you can manually adjust every point to your heart's content. So those are my 10 tips. What is your favorite tip for Affinity Designer on the iPad? I'd love to know. Let me know in the comment section down below. If you're new, like this video and also subscribe for more content like this. And don't forget about the discount code to my Affinity Designer course over on Udemy. I'd also like to shout out to everybody who's been taking part in the Finished Art Challenge. It's a little challenge thing we do around here where we take a featured artist every month and everybody has an opportunity to finish one of their sketches, see how everybody else does it, learn, practice, and grow. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll talk to you in a couple of days.